We are continuing our conversations with candidates for the at-large seats on Peoria City Council. And joining me today is Mr. John Kelly, who is one of those candidates, 15 overall candidates right now, running for election of 5 seats. So first, thanks for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me.
I want to start off, the other day we were a part of a forum. I moderated it, and you were a participant, obviously, within that. And you mentioned that you have a plan to make Peoria a growth city. First, can you explain the concept behind growth city, and then we can get into a little bit about your specific plans that you would want to implement?
Sure. A growth city is one where you've got a lot of capital investment going on, a lot of job creation happening, especially the more capital you have coming in, the more investment you have coming in, the higher the wage rate, so wages are rising. My own thought about Peoria is not so much a physical expansion of the city, but a reinvestment and repopulation of the core parts of our city, which are wonderfully located, but they've been declining in assessed value and population for decades.
What would you define as the core parts of our city?
The valley areas, the East Bluff, some of the West Bluff, those areas, let's say, close into downtown, which have been deteriorating, losing value for a long, long time, and for which we tend to have policies that address a specific problem here or a specific problem there. But I don't think we're addressing the real cause of a lot of these problems. And therefore, a lot of these programs, while very well intentioned and I think sincerely undertaken, don't tend to work very well. We continue to have the problems. As a matter of fact, things just keep getting a little worse. The deterioration continues, the depopulation continues. And I think we can turn that. I think we can turn that around.
And you mentioned the core problems. What would you identify as the core problems facing the city? Because you said there were root issues. What are those root issues that you say that these programs and the city has not yet really addressed?
We make it very difficult in the entire city to do business. We make it difficult to build. We make it difficult to conduct so many of the things that it is very difficult to start a business here. It can be very difficult to build a building here, especially a commercial building. We have we have a building code that's 900 pages long. If you're a contractor, it's a little difficult to memorize all that. Other places have policies, codes, regulations, ordinances that end up being much more welcoming to capital investment and therefore to employment, etc. So those kinds of things affect the entire city, and I'd like to go after them for the entire city. But the place where they're having the most difficult effect are in the core parts of our city, the older parts of our city that really need revitalization, and that, of course, are not getting it.
Now, I know another thing that a lot of business owners, property owners, landlords, et cetera, have said is another difficulty for them have been fees. And the city recently made the decision after the entire budget situation of a multi-million-dollar budget deficit that they had to close. One of the solutions was to add a fee, a parcel fee. Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask this question. I asked it to Dr. Ali the other day. Mm-hmm. If you were on the board, let's move forward. Let's say you are on the board, on the city council, excuse me, and conversation or a decision, because we know budgets can change. The opportunity comes in which you do have to decide between raising fees or cutting somewhere. Do you have any idea on where you would land or how you would approach that process?
Yeah, I do. First of all, that particular problem has been going on in our city for 30 years. We've been broke almost every year, okay? And the reason that we've been broke is that our tax base has been shrinking, okay? So we're bringing in less revenue. Generally, our solution to that is to do more things to harm the tax base. Raising penalty taxes, raising real estate taxes, raising sales taxes, okay, and cutting services, which also harms the tax base, okay? So if I were to, one thing I hadn't mentioned yet was our tax system. Our tax system is heavily oriented toward penalty taxation. Penalties for things we want more of. Okay, so we would like more buildings, and we have very high real estate tax. We'd like more commerce, but by golly, if you want to conduct some commerce here, we're gonna penalize you for that. So what I would do is I would look through the various ways you can raise revenue and look for those methods that have the least or no economic effect on people. We have a few of those right now. The very unpopular garbage fee, for instance, is a fee that no one likes, of course. No one likes taxes, okay. But that is a fee which has no negative economic effect. It doesn't penalize anybody for doing good things, okay. The flush tax that the sanitary district employs, which is kind of a use tax, okay, it does not penalize the good things. What I would do is I would start reshuffling that tax system. I would start cutting the real estate tax, cutting the sales tax, and substituting more of these head taxes or use taxes, taxes that don't penalize economic activity. I would have that substitution. In the process of doing that, let's say that's a zero-sum game, or it looks like a zero-sum game. Well, what happens to the assessed value of the city if we start cutting the real estate tax? The assessed value of the city is going to start to rise. The land value of Peoria, Illinois is going to start to rise. If we start cutting the sales tax, what's going to happen to sales in Peoria? Actually, they're going to rise, okay? So what will happen there is that all of a sudden City Hall ends up doing what looks like a substitution tax system, but they're getting more revenue in with no tax increases, okay? The ratio of buildings to land in Peoria, according to our assessor, is about 4 to 1. In growth cities, that ratio approaches 1 to 1.
What are some of those, you said growth cities, what are some cities that you're
those would be cities like Houston, like Portland, Oregon, like Charlotte, you know, these are Columbus, Ohio, you know, these are places that where seemingly tax revenue is high, but tax rates are low. These are places that are building and building, and you're sucking up all that excess labor in town and trying to bring in more. You have places where the minority communities are all in for this growth, and the problems that older northern cities have with minority communities or poor communities is are just not there. I'm sorry, they're always there to a certain extent, but not to the extent that they are in these older northern cities where we're getting most of our brilliant ideas.
I want to ask you about that. You mentioned poor communities, and you also mentioned minorities, which can be or are two separate groups. Although statistics show that in
minorities
a lot of cities
are overrepresented within the poor population.
Yeah. So what I wanted to ask you, obviously within the city of Peoria, there's been a lot of conversation regarding what the city can do, has done to support more diversity within the city, minority growth within business, 61605, which is probably one of the highest populations for African American per area, but also one of the poorest areas within the city. Still the grocery store situation. What would you do, or any thoughts that you have on bringing about more equity for minorities? You talked about business opportunities. What are some of those things in which your expertise can go into that as well, to that conversation?
All right, first of all, let's look at what we've done. You know, I'm old enough to remember when Mayor Bob Lenhausen appointed the first so-called Human Rights Commission in Peoria. And since that time, we have undertaken almost every kind of program that we can to combat discrimination. And by the way, we did have some serious discrimination in those days. Overt discrimination, I think, is pretty rare at this point. But there's still this gap. Okay, so we've done all these things that we're supposed to do time after time, and I think these things have been sincerely done. And where are we? We don't seem to be making any progress. Okay, so what can we do? Well, if we had a growth city, you know, we had that 24/7 survey. 2 years ago, we were named the worst city in the country for African Americans. Okay, we're still, or I think we're still like number 4 or something, or fifth. Okay. If you look at that list, and the list, the one I'm most familiar with is the one from 2 years ago. If you look at that list, 9 out of the 10 cities, worst cities, okay, were these older northern cities, okay, that are doing all this stuff, but it doesn't seem to be working. There were no growth cities on that list. Growth cities are trying to pull in as many people as they can because they've got jobs and jobs and jobs. One of the indications, let's say, of you know, how bad off things are is the crime rate in some of these poorer areas. I like to use the statistic. The cities of Houston and Chicago are about the same size. Houston has 220 police officers per 100,000 people. Chicago has 550 police officers per 100,000 people. So they've got 2.5 times as many policemen per 100,000. Who's got the higher crime rate? Chicago. Chicago is in decline. Chicago's only lost 1 million people in the last couple decades. Okay, Houston, they don't have time for crime. You know, people are on their way to jobs and whatnot, and the minority community in Houston is all in. It's not that there aren't any problems, but the problems are far, far, far less, and it's far easier to overcome them. We can do that here. We can do that. As a matter of fact, we might be able to do it more easily than a place like Houston because we're a smaller place. We know the players, you know, and so these growth policies can bring about a betterment of that community. This is a little different than directly going after what seems to be the problem. To me, it's not a problem. It's a symptom.
All right, my last question I have for you is this. Obviously, for the at-large seat, you'll be covering and representing all of the 5 districts within the city. What makes you the most qualified to receive one of those seats?
I believe I am the only candidate who offers real growth policies, both in regulation, in taxation, in things like tax abatement, which we've not talked about. We can revitalize our city by keeping an eye on things that impede growth instead of going directly at a problem, which again I would say is a symptom. You know, we have a deteriorating housing over here. We got too much crime over there. I mean, we have to continue to work on those things, but those are symptoms of a greater problem. I want to work on the greater problem, and we're going to see, if we can work on those, we're going to see those symptoms decline.
Okay. All right. Well, John Kelly, running for one of the 5 at-large seats, Peoria City Council. Best